For years, Americans were told that the US-Canada relationship was rock solid, almost boring in its stability, the longest undefended border in the world, integrated economies, shared values, quiet cooperation in NATO and NORAD, and a trade relationship so interwoven that most people never thought about where American cars, steel, or food actually crossed the line from one country into the other. Then came Donald Trump and his America First trade war. And suddenly the northern border became something else. A fault line, a stage, and ultimately a mirror, reflecting back the uncomfortable truth that when you treat your closest ally like a punching bag and the planet like a dumping ground, you should not be surprised when that ally starts sending your trash back, both literally and figuratively, and begins rewriting the script of the relationship in ways that leave America looking smaller, not greater. To understand how we got to the point where Canada rejects US trash became a shorthand for Trump's trade war backfire, you have to rewind to the moment he decided to slap tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum under Section 232 of U.S. trade law, the provision reserved for national security threats. Think about that for a second, a president declaring in official documents that Canadian metal, the output of foundries and mills run by workers who fought and bled beside American soldiers, constituted a national security risk on par with hostile regimes. Ottawa's response was not just policy, it was emotional. Canadians were used to being taken for granted, not accused of endangering America's safety. And when Trump followed up the tariffs with public insults, calling Canada very dishonest, and its prime minister weak, he cracked something deeper than a trade statistic. He cracked the assumption that Canada would always swallow its pride for the sake of keeping the peace. That's why, when stories began surfacing about Canada turning away shipments of poorly sorted, contaminated U.S. waste, plastic bales misdeclared as recyclables, mixed trash that no serious facility could process profitably or safely, Canadians saw more than a technical customs dispute. They saw a metaphor. Here was the United States, whose president had just launched a trade war against them, trying to offload yet another kind of burden, the physical byproducts of an economic model that consumed relentlessly at home and exported the mess abroad. For years, the global recycling and waste-to-trade system had been a quiet scandal. Rich countries like the United States patted themselves on the back for recycling, while stuffing containers with low-quality, contaminated plastic and paper and sending it overseas, where it often ended up burned, dumped, or left to choke rivers and oceans. When China's national sword policy slammed the door on much of that imported scrap, those containers needed a new destination. Some of them went north. Canadian regulators, already under pressure from their own citizens to stop being the last stop for somebody else's garbage, began inspecting inbound shipments more aggressively. And when they popped the latches on containers labeled as recyclables from U.S. brokers and found a stew of household waste, non-recyclable plastics, and materials that violated their standards, they faced a choice: quietly absorb the cost, as the old system expected them to do, or send a message. Under Trump, the mood in Ottawa had shifted. This was no longer the era of shrugging off Washington's bad behavior in the name of neighborly harmony. This was the era of retaliatory tariffs, G7 summits where the U.S. president stormed out and tore up communiques, and a public in both countries that could see, in real time, how America First was really working. So when Canada refused or returned suspect shipments of U.S. waste, it was more than a bureaucratic action. It was a quiet, potent rebuke. If you're going to tax our steel as if we were your enemy, don't expect us to be your landfill. At the same time, Trump's trade war was revealing its hollowness on the economic front. The tariffs he imposed on Canada were sold as a way to protect American workers and force better deals, but the reality on the ground was far messier. U.S. manufacturers who relied on Canadian inputs saw costs spike. Farmers caught in the crossfire of counter tariffs watched markets they'd spent years cultivating suddenly close or shrink. The renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA produced headlines about a great new deal. But when experts read the fine print, they found tweaks and updates, and not the revolutionary rewrite Trump had promised, and certainly nothing that justified declaring Canada a national security threat. Meanwhile, Canada was busy hedging its bets, moving ahead with trade agreements with Europe and Asia, deepening partnerships that meant future Canadian leaders would not be as dependent on access to the U.S. market. In that context, every time a Canadian port said no to incoming American trash, it wasn't just protecting local landfills or recycling systems. It was flexing a new kind of autonomy. The old pattern, America dictates, Canada accommodates, was breaking. And the symbolism ran even deeper than that. Trash is the most literal expression of what a society wants to get rid of. When one country sends another its rubbish, especially dressed up as something virtuous like recycling, it is saying, in effect, You deal with the consequences of our consumption. For years, Americans had absorbed Trump's boasts that he was forcing others to respect the U.S. again, making them pay, making them take our garbage, metaphorically in the form of worse deals and concessions. But in the physical world of ports and customs inspections, the script was inverting. Canada was putting its foot down and sending the garbage back. That inversion exposes the core flaw in Trump's trade war thinking. He believed that size alone, economic, military, political, gave the United States unlimited leverage, that partners would grumble, but ultimately fold because they had no choice. What he underestimated was the power of cumulative resentment and the availability of alternatives in a globalized economy. Screen. Canada could impose carefully targeted tariffs that hit politically sensitive sectors in the U.S. It could build closer ties with Europe and Asia. It could invest in its own recycling infrastructure and environmental standards, making it less desperate for whatever materials American brokers wanted to dump. The more it did those things, the more it could afford to say no, not just on the big issues like tariffs, but on the seemingly small ones like shipments of mislabeled waste. And because these choices were anchored in something broader than short-term anger, rooted in public concern about climate change, plastic pollution, creating an environmental justice, they weren't easily reversible by a change of mood in Washington. In other words, Trump's attempt to strong-arm Canada into deference ended up accelerating Canada's emancipation from that very dynamic. On paper, Trump could tweet that he'd won, that he'd forced a new deal, that Canada had been brought to heel. On the ground, the reality was more complicated. Canadian steel still flowed, the auto supply chains remained integrated, Korea and Canada now had more diversified markets and a stronger political mandate to stand firm on issues like waste imports, where it once might have quietly compromised. For Americans watching this from afar, the trash story might seem like a footnote. Who cares where some containers of garbage end up? But look closer and you see an X-ray of how power and reputation work in the 21st century. A country that wants to lead cannot behave like a spoiled customer sending back unwanted leftovers and expecting everyone else to clean up. It has to show that it can manage its own mess, economic, diplomatic, and literal, if it expects others to trust its promises. Under Trump, the U.S. sent the opposite message. We will break agreements on a whim, insult our closest allies to win applause at rallies, rip up climate commitments while wildfires and floods get worse, and then act shocked when those same allies balk at taking our trash, both rhetorical and physical. The backfire is not that Canada suddenly became anti-American. It's that Canada, like many partners, learned to separate the American people and the American idea from the particular administration in power, and to defend its own interests more assertively when that administration crossed lines. That's why you now hear Canadian politicians, even those ideologically aligned with U.S. conservatives, saying openly that they will not allow their country to be used as a dumping ground, that any trade relationship must respect environmental standards, that friendship does not mean submission. They've internalized a lesson that Trump never did. Respect is not extracted at tariff point. It is earned by reliability, self-discipline, and a willingness to shoulder your own burdens instead of exporting them. In the long run, historians may look back at the image of Canada rejecting U.S. trash as a turning point, not because of the tonnage of waste involved, but because of what it revealed about the end of an era when America could demand loyalty while sharing as little responsibility as possible. The irony is brutal. A president who promised to stop other countries from laughing at us ended up creating scenes in which they were sending our garbage back and still managing to look like the adults in the room. And for Canadians, the message to future U.S. leaders is implicit but unmistakable. If you want us to treat your problems as ours, from trade imbalances to security threats, you will have to rediscover the habits of true partnership, consultation, respect, long-term thinking, not the performative bullying that characterized Trump's trade war. Until then, don't be surprised if the next container you try to ship across the border, whether it's filled with tainted recyclables, one-sided demands, or the fallout of short-sighted policies, comes right back with a label that reads, in effect, "Return to sender."